Everyone said they were too busy to pick up my father after his surgery, so I canceled an important client meeting and drove 6 hours straight to the hospital. My name is Brenda Walsh. I am 38 years old. I work in medical equipment supply chain management and was halfway through a 2-day trip when the messages started coming in. One relative had a meeting that could not be moved. Another had already committed to a long-scheduled appointment. A third simply said the timing was impossible. No one asked if I could rearrange my plans. They just assumed I would handle it. I turned the car around without calling anyone back. The drive gave me time to think about how often this pattern repeated itself, yet I still showed up. When I reached the hospital entrance, my father was already waiting in a wheelchair near the curb. The nurse handed me a small bag of discharge papers and stepped away. He looked smaller than I remembered. The moment I helped him into the passenger seat, he closed his hand over my wrist with surprising strength. His voice dropped so low I had to lean in to hear it. "Don't let anyone know I left with you," he said. "Not a single person." I started the engine and pulled away from the building. Neither of us spoke for the first few miles. The weight of his words sat between us, heavier than the silence. I had no idea what he meant or why he needed the secret, but the look in his eyes told me this was not confusion from the surgery. Something had already been set in motion long before I arrived. If you have ever been the only one who showed up when everyone else found a reason to stay away, stay with me until the end. This story goes far deeper than one quiet request in a hospital parking lot. We had driven less than 10 miles from the hospital when Dad pointed to an exit and told me to take it. He said he did not want to go straight back to the farm. Before the surgery, he had found papers that showed plans to sell the black walnut timber and parts of the land. The discovery left him unsure who among his sons he could still trust, so he had put a backup plan in place. He directed me to a small brick building a few blocks from the county courthouse. The family lawyer, Edith Monroe, met us at the door. She had been expecting us because Dad had called her from the hospital the day before. She led us into a quiet conference room and closed the door. Dad placed a thick folder on the table. He explained that years earlier he had created a trust to keep the farm from being broken up. In recent months, he had added new instructions after he realized what my older brother Lawrence and my younger brother Wayne were arranging. He slid a small digital recorder across the table and pressed play. The recording was clear. Lawrence's voice talked about contacting a timber company while the prices were high. Wayne answered that they should move before any neighbors asked questions. The conversation had taken place in the farm office 2 weeks before the surgery. Dad said the longtime farm manager had overheard them and later brought him the recording because he felt the talk crossed a line. I listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, Dad looked at me. He said he had chosen me for one simple reason. I had never once asked him about the land or the timber value. I was also the only person who had rearranged everything and driven 6 hours when the others said they were too busy. Edith opened a second folder and reviewed the current trust papers with us. She made it clear that nothing had transferred yet. Dad wanted me only as a point of contact for now, someone who could reach her if his health changed again. I agreed to that limited role. I told them both I would not take any formal control of the property. Edith noted my statement in her file. Dad asked a few practical questions about how the trust would work if he became unable to speak for himself. Edith answered each one in plain terms. She confirmed that the original trust already protected the land from a forced sale. The recent additions simply named me as the person to notify if decisions had to be made quickly. She stressed that the farm would stay under the trust's rules, not under any individual's personal ownership. We spent nearly 2 hours going over the documents. Dad signed 2 updated pages while Edith and her assistant watched. He looked tired, but steady. When everything was finished, he thanked her and asked me to help him back to the car. Outside, the sky had already turned dark. I started the engine and waited for him to speak. He sat quietly for several minutes before he said that the secret was necessary because Lawrence and Wayne would have stopped the visit if they had known. He believed they would have pushed to bring him home immediately and then controlled every conversation that followed. I drove toward the farm in silence. The weight of the recording stayed with me. I kept seeing the calm way Dad had handled the papers, as if he had prepared for this day far longer than the surgery itself. He had not asked me to fight anyone. He had only asked me to show up and to keep one promise. When we reached the county road that led to the property, Dad told me to slow down. He wanted a few more minutes before we arrived. He said the farm manager who had brought him the recording had worked there for 22 years and had no reason to invent the conversation. That fact made the voices on the tape harder to dismiss. I asked if Phyllis knew about any of this. Dad shook his head. He said she had stayed out of the business side for years, but he no longer felt certain where her loyalties would land once money entered the discussion. He preferred to keep the circle small until he saw how everyone reacted. The last stretch of road felt longer than usual. Dad rested his head against the window and closed his eyes. I watched the familiar fence posts pass by and realized that the quiet request he had made in the hospital parking lot now made complete sense. He had not been confused. He had been protecting the one step he still controlled. We turned onto the gravel driveway just as the porch light came on. I parked near the side door so he would not have far to walk. Before I opened my door, Dad placed his hand on my arm one more time. He reminded me that my only job for the present was to stay reachable and to say nothing about the lawyer or the recording. I nodded. That was the agreement I had accepted in Edith's office, and I intended to keep it. Early the next morning, I helped Dad into the passenger seat and drove the final stretch to the Black Walnut Farm near Springfield. A farm worker had already called to say the truck was on the way, so Lawrence, Phyllis, and Wayne stood waiting near the side porch when we pulled in. Lawrence reached the door first and opened it without a greeting. He looked past me straight at Dad. "Where have you two been since yesterday afternoon?" he asked. Wayne stepped closer. "We called the hospital. They said you left with Brenda hours ago. No one knew where you went." Phyllis crossed her arms. "You could have answered your phone. We were left guessing the whole evening." I kept my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before I shut off the engine. Dad stayed quiet in the seat beside me. I got out, walked around, and helped him stand. He leaned on my arm as we moved toward the porch steps. Lawrence blocked the way. "I'm talking to you, Brenda." What took so long? I met his eyes. Dad asked me to drive. I drove. Wayne let out a short breath. "That's all you're going to say?" Phyllis spoke next, her voice tighter than the others. "You know this family has always been clear about who belongs here. You're the daughter of the second wife. That has never made you the same as the rest of us." The words hung in the air for only a few seconds. Dad lifted his head. "I need to rest," he said. His voice stayed even. "That's enough for now." He started up the steps on his own. I stayed close in case he lost his balance, but he managed the climb without help. Once inside, he went straight to the stairs that led to his bedroom. I followed far enough to make sure he reached the top safely. He paused at the landing, looked back once, and gave a small nod. Then he closed the bedroom door behind him. Downstairs, the three of them waited in the kitchen. Lawrence had already poured coffee. He set the cup down hard enough that it clicked against the counter. "You still haven't explained the hours you were gone," he said. I stayed by the doorway. "There is nothing more to explain. Dad needed a ride. I gave him one." Wayne shook his head. "People don't just disappear for half a day after surgery." Something else happened. Phyllis watched me without blinking. "If you did anything that affects this farm, we have a right to know." I did not answer. The promise I had made the day before stayed fixed in my mind. I had agreed to say nothing about the lawyer or the papers, and I intended to keep that agreement. Lawrence took a step toward me. "We're not asking for details about every stop. We only want to know why the hospital discharge turned into a long absence." I kept my voice level. Dad decided the schedule. I followed it. The silence that followed lasted longer than any of the questions. Wayne finally turned away and looked out the window toward the timber stands. Phyllis picked up her phone and began typing. Lawrence stayed where he was waiting for something more. I walked past them into the living room and checked the thermostat. The house felt cool, so I raised it 2 degrees the way Dad preferred. Then I returned to the kitchen and filled a glass with water. I carried it upstairs and set it on the nightstand beside his bed. He was already under the covers, eyes closed. His breathing sounded steady. I waited a full minute to be sure he was comfortable before I stepped back out. When I came downstairs again, none of them had moved much. Lawrence spoke first. "You're leaving already, Dad is settled." "That's what I came to do." Wayne turned from the window. "You should stay. We still have questions." I picked up my keys from the counter. "I've answered what I can." Phyllis put her phone down. "This isn't finished." I did not reply. I walked out the side door, crossed the gravel, and opened the truck. The 3 of them remained on the porch as I started the engine. No one called after me. I backed out slowly, turned onto the county road, and headed toward town. The drive gave me time to go over every word that had been spoken. The single remark about bloodlines had landed exactly as they intended, yet Dad's short request for rest had stopped the conversation cold. I had kept my side of the agreement. Nothing about the previous afternoon had left my mouth. By the time I reached the main highway, the sun was fully up. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the road stretch out ahead. The farm was behind me for now. Dad was in his own bed. The questions would wait. I had done what he asked, and that was the only measure that mattered at the moment. 4 days after I brought Dad home, the first call came from a neighbor who had heard talk at the feed store. People in the area were saying I had taken control of Dad's schedule and was keeping the rest of the family at a distance. The story had already grown by the time it reached me. Some versions claimed I had moved papers out of the house. Others said I was the only person allowed to speak with him about money. None of it matched what had actually happened yet. The talk spread fast in a place where most families had known each other for decades. That same afternoon, my longest-standing client called. I managed supply contracts for medical equipment, and this account had been steady for nearly 8 years. The purchasing manager spoke carefully. He said the company preferred to pause my involvement on the current project until the family situation settled. He made it clear the decision had nothing to do with my work. They simply did not want any chance of being pulled into private disputes. I thanked him for the direct notice and ended the call. By the next morning, I learned that Phyllis had spoken to several people in town. She told them I had never been treated as a full member of the family. The remark traveled quickly. A woman who worked at the bank repeated it to me when I stopped in to deposit a check. She looked uncomfortable saying it, but she wanted me to know what was being repeated. I drove out to the farm that evening. Dad was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he had not touched. He asked me to sit. After a short silence, he reached into the pocket of his shirt and placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. "This stays closed," he said. "You open it only after I am gone and things have turned against you." I did not reach for it right away. "What is inside instructions you will need if no one else will listen. Keep it somewhere safe." I picked up the envelope. It felt thicker than a single sheet of paper. Dad watched until I slid it into my bag. He then asked how work was going. I told him about the client who had stepped back. He nodded once, as if the news confirmed something he had already expected. "Pressure will keep rising," he said. "They will test every boundary they can find." I stayed another hour. We talked about ordinary things, the timber stands that needed thinning, and the fence line that still required repair. He never returned to the envelope. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door and rested a hand on my shoulder for a moment. On the drive home, I began rearranging my schedule. I contacted 2 smaller accounts and shifted deadlines so I could spend more days near the farm. The larger contracts would continue without me for a while. I sent the necessary notices that night. By the end of the week, the rumors had reached the hardware store and the diner. A man I had known since high school asked if it was true that Dad no longer made his own decisions. I answered that Dad was exactly the same as he had always been. The man looked unconvinced. I returned to the farm 2 days later. Dad was on the porch. He asked if I had found a secure place for the envelope. I told him it was locked in the file cabinet at my apartment. He seemed satisfied. Then he said something that stayed with me after I left. I am preparing for the day I cannot direct every detail myself. You need to be ready for that possibility. I sat with those words on the way back to town. The sealed envelope in my cabinet suddenly felt heavier. The client who had stepped away, the talk in the stores, Phyllis's comments to neighbors, all of it pointed in the same direction. Dad was not waiting for the conflict to arrive. He was already placing pieces where he believed they would be needed later. I spent the following days clearing my calendar. Meetings that could be handled by email were moved. Site visits that required my presence were postponed. Each change gave me another block of time I could spend at the farm without drawing more attention. I did not explain the reasons to anyone at work beyond the necessary professional notices. When I next saw Dad, he looked tired but clear. He asked no questions about the rumors. He only checked that I still carried the responsibility he had given me. I confirmed that nothing had changed. He nodded and returned to the newspaper on the table. The pressure continued in small ways. A supplier who used to return my calls within an hour now took a full day. A colleague asked almost in passing whether the family trouble was affecting my focus. I answered that my work remained the same. The question itself showed how far the talk had traveled. I kept the envelope locked away and followed the schedule I had set. More hours at the farm, fewer hours in the office. Dad never asked me to stay longer than I already planned. He simply accepted the time I gave and used it to go over ordinary farm matters. Yet each visit made the purpose of the sealed envelope clearer. He was arranging for a future in which his voice might no longer be the final one. I was the person he had chosen to hold the next set of instructions. 6 weeks after the discharge, Dad died on a winter morning. The call came just after sunrise. The hospice nurse spoke in a steady voice and said he had passed quietly in his sleep. I drove to the farm at once. Lawrence and Wayne were already in the kitchen when I arrived. Phyllis came in a short time later. No one said much. We made the necessary calls and began the arrangements. The funeral took place 3 days later at the small church Dad had attended for most of his life. People filled the pews. Neighbors, old friends from the timber business, and men who had worked the land with him over the years all came. I sat near the back. During the service, I kept thinking about the sealed envelope still locked in my cabinet and the quiet way Dad had prepared everything. He had tried to keep me clear of the worst of the conflict while he was still able to speak for himself. That realization settled deeper with every hymn. After the burial, Edith asked the immediate family to stay for a brief reading of the trust. We gathered in a side room of the church. Edith opened a folder and reviewed the main terms in plain language. The farm and timber rights remained under the trust. No single person could force a sale. She then stated that I had been named as the person to receive notice and to assist with any decisions that required quick action. Lawrence stood up before she finished. "That cannot stand," he said. Dad was not in any condition to make those changes after the surgery. Wayne supported him at once. "We need the court to look at this." Phyllis stayed silent but did not disagree. Edith closed the folder and said the proper place for any challenge was the probate court. She offered to provide copies of every document. Lawrence left the room without another word. 2 days later, a process server handed me a summons at my apartment. Lawrence had filed a petition asking the court to examine Dad's mental capacity at the time the additional trust papers were signed. The petition named me as an interested party and claimed I had influenced the decisions. I read the pages twice, then called Edith. She told me to come to her office the following morning. When I arrived, she already had a growing stack of files on the conference table. She had requested the hospital records that covered the days around the surgery. She had also begun gathering emails and draft agreements that showed contact with a timber company in the months before Dad entered the hospital. Some of the messages carried dates that preceded the surgery by several weeks. Edith walked me through the timeline she was building. The medical notes indicated Dad had answered every cognitive question correctly before he signed the updates. The emails suggested the interest in selling timber had existed well before any health crisis. She said the combination would matter in court. I sat across from her and listened. The petition made the conflict public. There was no longer a way to stay on the edges. I told Edith I would not step back. She nodded and said that was the answer she needed. We spent the next 2 hours sorting the papers into order. She labeled each group and explained what she planned to request next from the timber company and from the hospital. That evening, I returned to the farm to check on the place. The house felt empty. I walked through the rooms once, made sure the heat was set correctly, and locked the door again. On the drive home, I kept returning to the moment in the church when Lawrence stood and objected. The challenge had come exactly as Dad seemed to have expected. The sealed envelope remained unopened, but its purpose was no longer abstract. Over the following days, Edith sent updates. She had obtained certified copies of the trust amendments. She had spoken with the hospital records department and confirmed the cognitive evaluations were complete. She was waiting on a response from the timber company regarding the draft contracts. Each piece of information tightened the picture. I adjusted my work schedule again so I could meet with her whenever new documents arrived. The summons required a formal response within a set number of days. Edith prepared the answer and I signed it. We filed it on time. Lawrence's attorney sent a short letter requesting a preliminary hearing date. Edith answered with the medical records and a summary of the trust history. The exchange stayed professional and cold. No one suggested mediation. I spent one afternoon alone at the farm walking the edge of the timber stands. The black walnut trees stood quiet under the winter sky. Dad had spent years protecting this land through the trust. Now the trust itself was the point of attack. I understood that the next months would be decided in a courtroom rather than in family conversations. When I met Edith the next week, she placed a new folder in front of me. Inside were printed emails that showed Lawrence and Wayne discussing possible buyers months earlier. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. Edith said these would form part of the evidence if the case moved forward. I read them without comment. By the end of that week, the decision felt settled. I would stay involved for as long as the court process required. Dad had placed the responsibility in my hands while he could still choose. Walking away would leave that choice unfinished. I told Edith I was prepared to continue. She made a note in her file and said we would begin preparing for the hearing. The hearing took place on a day of light rain. I sat at the table with Edith while Lawrence and his attorney occupied the seats across the aisle. The judge entered and the clerk called the case. Lawrence's attorney stood first and laid out their position in clear terms. He described me as someone outside the core family who had used Dad's weakened state after surgery to gain influence over the estate. He repeated that the changes to the trust had appeared only after the hospital stay and claimed the timing itself raised serious questions. Edith rose when it was her turn. She placed the original trust documents on the podium and explained the structure in plain language. The farm and timber rights belong to the trust, not to any individual. I had been named only as the person responsible for protecting those assets according to the terms Dad had set. I held no personal ownership and could not sell or borrow against the property. She next introduced the hospital records. The attending physician's notes showed that Dad had completed a full cognitive evaluation the day before he signed the additional pages. He had answered every question correctly. The doctor had recorded no concern about confusion or impaired judgment. Edith read the relevant paragraphs aloud so the court could hear the exact wording. The next set of exhibits consisted of emails recovered from Lawrence's and Wayne's accounts. The messages carried dates that fell weeks before the surgery. In one exchange, Lawrence wrote about contacting a regional timber buyer while prices remained high. Wayne replied that they should prepare the paperwork so the deal could move once the land was free of restrictions. Edith projected the pages onto the screen and gave the court time to read each line. She then offered a draft contract that had been prepared by the same timber company. The document listed estimated volumes of black walnut and proposed payment terms. The date on the draft preceded Dad's hospital admission by nearly 2 months. Lawrence's attorney objected on relevance, but the judge allowed the exhibit after Edith established the connection to the earlier emails. Edith called the longtime neighbor Clifford Hayes to the stand. Clifford had lived on the adjoining property for more than 30 years and had worked alongside Dad on fence lines and timber sales in the past. He testified that he had been present in the farm office on 2 separate occasions when Lawrence and Wayne discussed possible buyers. He recalled Wayne mentioning that the timing would be better if certain legal obstacles were cleared. Clifford stated that he had later told Dad what he had heard because the conversation troubled him. After Clifford stepped down, Edith requested permission to play the recording. The small device was connected to the courtroom speakers. Lawrence's voice came through, first speaking about splitting the timber proceeds. Wayne answered that waiting any longer made no sense. The background sound of a chair scraping across the office floor was clear. When the recording ended, the room stayed quiet for several seconds. Edith waited until the judge indicated she could continue. She then asked me to bring forward the sealed envelope Dad had given me. I carried it to the witness stand. The judge instructed me to open it in full view of the court. Inside were several handwritten pages. Edith asked me to read them aloud. Dad's letter began with a direct address to his children. He wrote that he had watched the interest in selling the land grow while he was still measuring his remaining days. He named Lawrence and Wayne and stated that they had measured the farm in dollars. He then turned to me. He wrote that the only person who had never asked him for anything was the one he trusted with the responsibility that mattered most. He had chosen me because I had shown up when the others found reasons to stay away. The final paragraph instructed me to protect the land under the terms of the trust and to refuse any pressure to break it apart. I finished reading and returned to my seat. The judge asked both attorneys if they had further questions. Lawrence's attorney requested a short recess. Edith used the time to organize the remaining medical summaries. When court resumed, the judge stated that he would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. I left the courthouse with Edith. She said the combination of the medical records, the pre-surgery emails, the draft contract, Clifford's testimony, the recording, and the letter formed a clear sequence. I thanked her and drove back toward town. The rain had slowed to a fine mist. The letter's words stayed with me through the entire drive. Dad had set the responsibility in place long before the hearing began. The court now held the evidence that showed how and why he had done so. 2 weeks after the ruling, the formal order arrived in the mail. The court upheld the trust in full. I was appointed trustee with the single duty of protecting the farm and the timber rights exactly as Dad had directed. The order stated clearly that I held no personal ownership and could not sell, mortgage, or divide any portion of the land. Edith called the same morning to confirm the language and to schedule a meeting so we could review the next practical steps. She explained that Lawrence's decision to challenge the trust had triggered the no contest provision. As a result, the share of benefits that Lawrence, Phyllis, and Wayne would otherwise have received was reduced according to the terms Dad had written years earlier. Edith said the reduction was automatic once the court found the challenge lacked merit. She advised me to keep a complete record of every action I took as trustee, in case further questions arose. News of the ruling moved quickly through the local business community. Within days, I learned that Lawrence had lost a substantial commercial contract he had been negotiating for nearly a year. The other party informed him they preferred not to continue discussions while the estate dispute remained public. The loss removed a significant portion of the revenue he had counted on for the coming season. Wayne faced a different pressure. The legal fees from the court case had accumulated faster than he expected. He sold a small storage building and a pair of work trucks that had been part of his side business in order to cover the remaining invoices. The sale was recorded at the county office and became common knowledge within a short time. I made no contact with any of them after the order was issued. When Lawrence left a voicemail asking to discuss the timber stands, I deleted the message without returning the call. Phyllis sent a brief text stating that the family needed to speak. I blocked the number. Wayne attempted to reach me through a mutual acquaintance. I asked the acquaintance to deliver a clear reply that I would not respond. From that point forward, the only communication that took place was through Edith's office when formal notices were required. I began the trustee work the following week. The first task was to meet the longtime farm manager and review the current condition of the black walnut stands. We walked the boundary lines and noted the sections that needed thinning. I authorized the necessary permits and set a schedule for the work to begin after the ground dried. Every decision was recorded in a simple log that Edith had prepared. Next, I contacted the accountant who had handled Dad's farm records for more than a decade. We transferred the trust accounts into the proper structure and established a clear process for paying property taxes and insurance. I insisted that every check require 2 signatures, mine and the accountant's, so that the record remained transparent. The daily routine settled into a steady pattern. I drove to the farm 3 mornings each week, checked the progress of the timber work, and returned to town to handle the paperwork. Neighbors who had known Dad for years stopped by occasionally to ask how the land was being managed. I answered with the facts and nothing more. No one pressed for details about the court case, and I offered none. Edith scheduled a short review meeting each month. She examined the log, the receipts, and the bank statements. She found no irregularities and said the court would have no reason to question the administration if any further inquiry ever arose. I kept the meetings brief and focused only on the practical requirements of the trust. The reduced benefits under the no contest clause remained a private matter between the siblings and the court. I never asked Edith for the exact figures, and she never volunteered them. My responsibility stopped at protecting the land itself. Everything beyond that belonged to the terms Dad had set and to the consequences the court had already ordered. By the end of the first month, the timber thinning was underway. The farm manager reported that the selected trees had been marked, and the crew was working carefully to avoid damage to the remaining stand. I walked the area once to confirm the work matched the plan we had approved. The process felt steady and quiet, exactly the way Dad had managed the place for years. I continued to keep every record in order. The sealed envelope stayed locked in the cabinet at my apartment, its contents already known to the court. There was no further need to open it. The ruling had confirmed the path Dad chose, and my task was simply to follow it without deviation. 6 months after the ruling, I moved into a small house a short drive from the farm. The place was plain and practical. I brought only what I needed and set up a simple routine that kept me close enough to oversee the land without living in the main house. Each morning, I checked in with the man I had hired to manage the timber according to the exact terms written in the trust. He marked trees for selective cutting, kept the boundary lines clear, and filed every required report. No acre was offered for sale. No section was open to outside buyers. The work stayed steady and quiet. Lawrence, Phyllis, and Wayne made no further attempts to reach me. Their names no longer appeared in my phone or in any message that came to the farm. The silence felt final. I did not seek news of them, and none was offered by the few people who still spoke to both sides. The distance settled into place without ceremony. Over the following months, I began to understand something that had taken time to accept. Sharing the same last name had never guaranteed loyalty. The connection I once assumed would hold had broken under the weight of choices other people made. Peace arrived only after I stopped expecting them to become different from the people they had already shown themselves to be. The daily work of the trust left little room for looking backward. I reviewed the accounts each month with the accountant, walked the stands with the manager, and signed the papers that kept the property taxes and insurance current. The land remained intact. That single fact matched the instruction Dad had left, and it was enough. Looking back on the months that followed the hospital discharge, 3 things stand out with lasting clarity. First, showing up when everyone else finds a reason to stay away carries a weight that words cannot match. The simple act of being present when it is inconvenient often reveals more about character than any promise made in easier times. Second, responsibility does not flow automatically from blood. It is earned by the decisions a person makes when the cost is real and the outcome uncertain. Third, protecting what is right does not require revenge. The quiet fulfillment of a duty can stand on its own without the need to see others suffer. These lessons did not arrive all at once. They formed slowly through the ordinary tasks of keeping the farm in order and through the steady absence of the people who had once filled the family table. I carry them now without bitterness. The land is secure. The trust continues. That is the measure I use. Thank you for staying with this story until the final page. I respect the time you gave to hear it through. If Brenda's choice to protect the land and step away from the conflict raises questions or thoughts of your own, I invite you to share them in the comments. Your perspective matters. If you have ever been told that setting a boundary means you are selfish, this moment is for you. So many of us grew up believing that love required constant sacrifice, that saying no was a failure of loyalty, that wanting space or fairness somehow made us less worthy of family. The truth is quieter and stronger than those old messages. You have the right to be respected. You have the right to say no without explaining yourself into exhaustion. You have the right to want a life that does not cost you your peace. Treating yourself with care is not the opposite of loving other people. It is the ground on which healthy relationships can actually stand. When you protect your own well-being, you stop offering versions of yourself that are depleted and resentful. You become able to give from a place that is steady instead of empty. That shift does not make you cold. It makes you honest. Brenda's story is one version of that choice. She showed up when others stayed away. She kept a promise. She walked forward without demanding that the people who hurt her suddenly become different. In doing so, she found a quieter kind of strength. If any part of this story touched something familiar in your own life, I would be honored to hear it. Share what you are carrying or what you have finally put down in the comments below. Your words may help someone else feel less alone tonight. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. Your time and attention mean more than you know. If this message found you at the right moment, please like the video, subscribe for more stories about boundaries and quiet courage, and take a look at the other videos waiting in the description. Protecting your own peace is not selfish. It is the necessary beginning of every life that can truly hold love without losing itself.